מאמר לוגי-אמוני, מאת דוקטור אלון גלעדי. אל באר דרך האמת. על החזרה האמונית-תבונית לאלהים.
D.1. In rational faith, the truth is God, and there is no exception to it. D.2. God is the reality that is beyond being, and the being created from his reality together. D.3. Do not say, in rational faith, that there is no reality like his reality, and do not say that there is no truth like his truth, but rather, he is the unattainable reality and the absolute besides which there is no other. D.4. The distinction between the reality of God and the reality of being included in him is for the needs of human thought, which does not comprehend the reality of God that includes being and is reality, and there is no exception to it. D.5. The boundary between the reality of God and the reality of being is a necessary derivative of his reality, and the reality of being created from his reality and included in it. D.6. The boundary is an a priori rational faith form in human thought, for the word of the Torah is expressed in human language and not without reason. D.7. In rational faith, the purpose of man is to worship God, including keeping the sublime and exemplary Torah, the fundamental and created Torah, in a sublime, exemplary, and eternal way. The purpose of man as a thing with consciousness and will, from a starting point of God, stems from the aspiration for truth and action, in accordance with the way of truth, in a way that is both interpretative essential and meaningful high. D.8. In rational faith, the purpose of man is to seek the truth through exemplary and sublime thought and action, in the reality of being and the limit on his being side, and while creating a constantly new, old, sublime being. D.9. Therefore, it was said of Moses in relation to Jehovah, face to face, and by Moses in relation to Israel, and who would give all the people of Jehovah through prophets? Deuteronomy 10. Therefore, the last verse in Deuteronomy 4 should not be seen as the end of the old, basic Torah, but rather, in Joshua 1:10, our opinion regarding the origin of these 10 verses will be as long as we remain in reference to the imprecise division into books, chapters, and verses that is currently practiced in the matter of the Bible. D.11. Therefore, the Bible should not be seen as the end verse for the development of rational, exemplary, and exalted faith that is eternal from the perspective of man, for it is said, I have made a new covenant, but in an exemplary and exalted manner, for he will not see by the sight of his eyes, nor judge by the hearing of his ears. Righteousness is the girdle of his waist, and faith is the girdle of his loins. D.12. In rational faith, the purpose of man is to recognize in the true way what is present and worthy of recognition in existence, and the limit of his existential side, and to choose to act according to what is worthy, and at the same time create an exalted, rational sensory/rational faithful meaning, to change the existence that preceded his exalted thought and will, to recognize the new old existence and again create in it in an exalted manner, and so on. D.13. In rational faith, the exalted, meaningful thought, which creates a new old existence, is in itself, by definition, part of the exemplary and exalted, rational faithful of what ought to be. D.14. In rational faith, the service of God is exemplary interpretative thought, and elevated meaningful thought, and exemplary and elevated action, respectively, at all levels of human thought, theoretical, moral, and rational faith. D.15. The exemplary and elevated rational faith is the Israeli faith. D.16. The Israeli faith is a universal faith. D.17. In rational faith, the garden of faith rational is the universal garden of faith rational reason, which grows and develops in an exemplary, sublime, and eternal manner. D.18. The Israeli faith respects the various subjective beliefs and sees the believer as a human intellectual and practical transcendence, as long as it does not harm the right of another person to absorb, process, interpret, create, and act according to his free will, respectively. D.19. The subjective free will observation of the various beliefs is important both in terms of fulfilling the free will of the members of their communities and for the purpose of constant correction in the way of truth. D.20. True faith is a faith that strives for truth and recognizes that by definition, it will not be achieved. The aspiration for true faith is necessarily and by definition free-willed, both exemplary and sublime. D.21. Rational faith is the worship of God from the exemplary combination of being and the limit on the part of being as the creator of consciousness and of the voluntary consciousness as the creators of being. D.22. The worship of God in the Israeli faith is to cultivate and preserve the unattainable truth in the garden of pure rational faith in a manner that is both sublime and exemplary, and in its obligation is the preservation of the tree of life, as distinguished from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. D.23. The Israeli faith is the sublime combination of knowing the present and knowing and doing what is right, of exemplary and supreme meaning and interpretation, as both rational and faith-based universality by definition. D.24. The foundation of the Israeli faith is in the rational faith interpretation of being, of the boundary from its existential side, and in the rational faith meaning, sublime harmony and exemplary identification with God and with people. D.25. The Israeli faith is not particular national, but rational universal. The Israeli faith acts in relation to specific cases from a universal example and transcendence by various means, including particular and others. D.26. The Israeli faith is not messianic mystical, but free, rational, and infinite. D.27. The Israeli faith is not a faith of obedience, but a faith of free will and rational thought, rational, exemplary, and sublime. D.28. The Israeli faith is the true rational faith, since it strives for the victory of the will to truth, and not for victory in itself, which is in practice the fallacy of the will to power in its shades and subsections. D.29. In the Israeli faith, for every religious rational absorption, there is one exemplary and unattainable rational religious interpretation, and there are endless meanings approaching the complete transcendence that will never be achieved. D.30. In the Israeli faith, for every complex literal, there is one simple and unattainable interpretive exemplary sermon. In the Israeli faith, for every complex literal, and for every exemplary and simple sermon, there is a sublime, simple, and infinite meaningful sermon that seeks the complete transcendence that will never be achieved. D.31. In the Israeli faith, every letter, every word, and every sentence has a deep meaning that integrates with the fundamental written religious rational being, with the specific and general religious rational being, and with the boundary on its existential side, which are the unity of natural rational faith and sublime rational faith. D.32. In the Israeli faith, every combination of letters that joins the words that join the sentence in order to identify with the being and with the existential side of the boundary has one true interpretation. The one true interpretation is found in an exemplary identification with all the combinations of letters within the framework of the text in which this combination is found, and with the being and the boundary on its existential side, from a request for a pure identification with them that will never be fully achieved. D.33. In the Israeli faith, there is a doctrine of rational faith names that are found within the framework of a rational faith text, whose rational faith foundation is the Torah, and whose rational faith covenant is constantly renewed, exemplary and sublime. D.34. Understanding the combination of letters begins with rational faith in their absorption as simple. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And he came to the man to see what he would call it. And whatever the man called a living soul, that was its name. And the man called names, And the Lord said to Moses, Behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you. And the people went out and gathered a day's worth, that I might test them, whether they would walk in my law or not. Continuing the understanding of the combination of letters in rational faith in a fundamental summative way, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. And in a meaningful interpretive way, concluding for the time being, and he shall smell in the fear of the Lord, and he shall not judge by what he sees with his eyes, nor reprove by what he hears with his ears. And he shall judge the poor with righteousness, and reprove with equity for the meek of the earth. And he shall smite the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he shall smite the sea of wickedness. And righteousness shall be the girdle of his loins, and faithfulness the girdle of his reins. D.35. In the Israeli faith, thought is the absorption and exemplary intellectual processing towards an exemplary interpretation, and a sublime, meaningful processing towards a sublime creation of the heavens, the abstract things, and what is in between, and of the earth, the natural things, and what is in between both. D.36. In the Israeli faith, the purpose of thought is the explanation of being, and the boundary from its existential side, through exemplary interpretation, and the creation of a new old being through the sublime meaning, and the sublime free choice between options for action. In the Israeli faith, the new old Torah is the constant new old covenant, which is the unity of the sublime consciousness that creates being, and the being that creates exemplary consciousness. D.37. In the Israeli faith, there are general teachings with different degrees, one after the other, and even secondary teachings in their content that come into developing expression. From Noah's Ark to the Ark of Moses, to the tabernacle with the tent of meeting and the Ark of the Covenant, and to the decline to the tabernacle in Kiryat Yearim, to Solomon's temple, to the second temple, to Herod's temple, and from there to the development to the small temple, and to the exemplary and highest fourth temple. The fourth temple in rational faith is the Israeli faith itself, which is given in a permanent manner to every woman and man who dedicates themselves to the truth, from an exemplary and exalted rejection of their previous and erroneous habits in the place on which they stand. The concern of rational faith as the fourth temple is in the four dimensions of rational faith reality: the natural reality, Jehovah, was/is/will be, and the path of the inclusive reality, God, within the boundary, Jehovah God, as its expression and its exemplary and highest degree in every woman and man as a substance and as a message. D.38. In the Israeli faith, God is the reality beyond the world that created the world/being and encompasses it. D.39. In the Israeli faith, Jehovah God is the boundary on both sides between being and God. D.40. In the Israeli faith, Jehovah is the natural world in the religious rational reality. D.41. In the Israeli faith, the natural and abstract being is the heavens and the earth and all their host. D.42. In the Israeli faith, the abstract things and what is between them are the heavens, the natural things and what is between them are the earth. The exemplary and supreme will is the spirit, and the exemplary and supreme volitional consciousness is the Spirit of God. D.43. In the Israeli faith, a thing with consciousness and will is a living soul. D.44. In the Israeli faith, the things with consciousness and the highest will among the things with consciousness and will are found in the volitional and exemplary man in his fundamental physical foundation as a complementary opposite of a type of will to power, male and female. D.45. In the Israeli faith, man as an intelligent living soul whose purpose is the will to power is male and female. D.46. In the Israeli faith, the exemplary and highest rational faith man, whose purpose is the desire for truth, is the unity of woman and man as one gospel, as the essence that is distinct from the essence of the Torah of Jehovah God. D47. In the Israeli faith, the Garden of Eden is the pure rational faith, the exemplary and highest Torah, the universal Torah that man strives to serve and preserve in a constant manner. D48. In the Israeli faith, objective thought is found in good and the pure objective in the very good. D49. In the Israeli faith, the foundation of subjective thought is found in the serpent and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. D50. In the Israeli faith, the reality of the world/being that influences consciousness is found on the Sabbath day/light, which follows the creation of being by the free and absolute rational will, the Spirit of God in Jehovah God, in the 6 days/lights of the fundamental covenant, which is imbued with the rational faithful Torah, which is a rational faith introduction containing rational fundamental faith concepts for the service of God, for the will to truth. D.51. In the Israeli faith, the complexity of things in being and free will are the guardians of the path to the tree of life, which is the path of the eternal Torah, which develops in an exemplary, sublime, and perpetual manner from the will to truth, which will never be achieved to serve and preserve God. D.52. The distance between the path of the tree of life and the intellectual and practical potential of each and every one of us is like the distance between the people thirsting for the waters of strife, who claim that Jehovah is not present, and their war with Amalek, who rose up to destroy them, that is, the struggle to maintain rational faith versus the struggle to uproot it, is present among the believers themselves during their faith-rational weakness. D.53. In the Age of Enlightenment, the Copernican revolution regarding Kant's pure reason is similar to the relationship between Aristotle and Copernicus and between Newton and Einstein. D.54. In the era of Israeli faith, the Copernican revolution regarding Giladi's pure rational faith is similar to the relationship between Abraham and Jacob and between Jacob and Moses and beyond. D.55. According to Israeli faith, the beginning of a philosophical/faith rational change, or its continuation, is never the end of a verse, but a struggle in the chain of the aspiration for interpretive identification and the aspiration for the meaningful harmony of human thought and action vis-a-vis being and the limit on its existential side. D.56. The end of every Copernican revolution, insofar as it does not develop from its rational exemplary refutation, and the setting up of a rational revolution against it, is subjective thought to the point of pure subjective thought that is necessarily on the path of error, especially in the fields of philosophy and faith, but not only. D.57. Philosophical and/or religious thought, like any interpretive thought that develops in a way that is not a rational exemplary refutation, is a thought that develops from subjective reflections, and the erroneous and even dangerous end is found in the foundations of its development. D.58. The silence of philosophers who strive in an exemplary way for the foundations is the silence of rational morality, the end of the thinking, free and equal-willed man. D.59. The silence of the highest rational faith is the end of man. D.60. This silence can develop from a naive error in its subjective formality, such as that of Nietzsche, or worse, it can develop from the ultimate philosophical error of silencing human thought, such as that of Wittgenstein et al. D.61. There is no fundamental difference between silencing, denigrating, and humiliating by the accepted genre in modern and postmodern thought towards those who seek to correct their failure, and raising to the center or threatening to raise to the center the genre accepted in faith from the Middle Ages to the beginning of the modern era. These and these are bloodshed. These and these are enemies of reason and rational faith. These and these are the Amalek of man's rational religious faith against himself, against his flesh. D.62. The unity of humiliation, contempt, and silencing between the so-called rational thinkers, or accepted genre, in modern times, and the governmental institutions in the society of capital, rule, and modern nationalism, and/or the degenerate and irrational religious institutions, exemplary in their types, is the modern inquisition that binds man in its transparent and murderous shackles. The union of modern false prophets and the rule of capital and nationalism is the modern inquisition that works to kill the people of truth without putting them on the pyre, to stone without mercy the woodcutters on the Sabbath in the desert. D63. This association is disguised when these people call themselves philosophers or prophets, and they are the complete opposite of this. It is disguised when they speak from their power, fame, and knowledge to the flock of their silent flock, out of admiration, shock, and/or ignorance in the face of their encyclopedic knowledge in their fields. On the other hand, it is revealed to a small part of the public only rarely when they mistakenly converse out of their arrogance due to their power, or against their will, with people of the path of truth who seek to contradict their path in an exemplary manner from its foundations. Then the ugly truth of their unexemplary and fundamentally untrue nature erupts, in a manner of distorted copying adapted to their subjective path, along with humiliation, contempt, and personal silencing towards the exemplary and/or exalted thinkers who stand before them. D.64. Thus, modernity has produced philosophers who see the subject as the sole essence, the burning problems as the starting point. Men of untruth who wave artificial flags of freedom or feigned concern. Thinkers of silence who pride themselves on not searching for the one and unattainable truth, or on unwillingness to conduct an exemplary search for the foundations, or on silencing, disparaging, and humiliating those who seek it. These philosophers and thinkers are parallel to the false prophets, in the past, who uphold the government and the degenerate institutions from which most of them enjoy and feed, but without a starting point of God. D.65. In short, a striking characteristic of these false prophets and thinkers is the absence of essential, true, and real discourse, and their call for a sincere discourse, in which the parties do not seek to win or impress, but intend to learn and search for the truth. Then they work to silence, belittle, and humiliate the seekers of truth within a discourse that is entirely in practice for them, known with certainty only to them, to win and impress. D.66. An honest discourse does not really exist, since no one knows what the other interlocutor is thinking and what his motives are, and therefore, defining it as such is empty of content and allows for domination in the discourse, silencing, and even humiliation within the framework of those who dare to seek a true discourse of truth and honesty in the face of those false thinkers and prophets. D.67. The existence of a proper discourse, true, real, substantial, and free, are understandable conditions for progress in discourse towards truth in all areas of human thought, science, morality, and faith. D.68. And like those philosophers devoid of real philosophy, so too do the religious men who quibble over texts that only they and their ilk are capable of reading due to their complexity and inaccessible to the audience seeking example and refutation, not to mention the developments of the non-exemplary and non-elevated developments in their concern with perpetuating their rule over their audience and their demand for power over the entire audience. These are the sages of subjective religion, who consider preaching the commandments actually created by them and their predecessors as correct within the framework of a faith development that is neither rational exemplary nor rationally elevated, and which essentially contradicts the foundations of rational faith itself, who are comparable in their status and actions to the false prophets of days gone by. D.69. Strangely enough, like their counterparts in philosophy, the love of power and power that replaced the love of wisdom and the search for truth, the actions of false prophets in the religious sphere are characterized by silencing, disparaging, and humiliating those who call for exemplary discourse, as well as by close ties with their own rule over their flocks, and even their close ties with the general government in the society of capital, rule, and nationalism for the sake of perpetuating their own rule. D. 70. A prominent characteristic of these religious people, as well as of postmodernism, is the irrational disconnection from the basics, often even a practice that is the opposite of them and of their faith-rational development. This practice is prominently expressed in the silencing, denigration, and humiliation of those who seek to renew as before with the required change. Another prominent characteristic is their connections with the civil government, and especially with that which maintains capital government and nationalism that are the opposite of the foundations of rational faith. D. 71. The characteristics of secular and religious false prophets can be characterized in sentences such as, "Since the destruction of the temple, prophecy has been given to fools," or, "The correct method in philosophy will, indeed, be this, to say only what can be said, that is, sentences from the natural sciences, that is, something that has no relation to philosophy." And in our case, these and these mean false prophecy and philosophy and the persecution of seekers of the path to truth. D. 72. Sometimes, people of subjective religions and/or subjectivist philosophers with power, wealth, and the media's power will seek to portray themselves as wise men on the cover. D. 73. But a detailed and in-depth observation of their actions, even without having to refer to their personal resume, indicates that they are in fact servants of the rule of imaginary subjective thought, and, as a derivative of this, the rule of its conceptual and practical products. Modern thinkers and false prophets work ideologically and/or practically to silence and bind the free and equal, rational and religious rational man to their rule and the rule of their friends. D. 74. Modern man is bound in the shackles of silence, humiliation, and degradation to the aristocracy of capital, religion, and subjectivist thought. D. 75. Man's future and redemption are found, as always, in his free and exemplary struggle against madness, crimes, and injustice wherever they are, in thought and in action. D. 76. How much more are man's future and redemption found in the exemplary and sublime struggle against people of the religious and/or subjective theoretical establishment, who decide and develop laws upon laws, mystical messianic, or authoritarians who lack a religious rational exemplary figure, who speculate whether they join the government or maintain government, and even money through subjective developments of the foundations of the sublime faith. D. 77. The defining essence of subjective philosophers or people of subjective faith is in distancing man's thought from what is proper in the face of what is proper and imaginary. Their essence/form is derived from the urge and idea of the will to power that is at the heart of their error and their actions, including the careers they have built for themselves based on them, towards preaching their personal thought that relies on their intellectual knowledge in their field as constituting everything and this is everything. D. 78. The most prominent and essential signs of the silencing and even tyranny of the philosophical and/or religious false prophets are their clear or perhaps subtle and hidden action to silence philosophy and rational faith that deal with the ideal vision and the meaningful transcendence in the face of the present. D. 79. The silencing and tyranny by the subjective and/or speculative philosophers and people of faith receive practical expression in the elitism that characterizes them. Sometimes the silencing and tyranny are expressed by the philosophers in the demand for clarity in language itself, while eliminating the necessity of reaching clarity through the complexity required by the reality of simplicity. Sometimes the silencing and tyranny against the path of truth are found among the religious, in the complexity of details that presents itself as a wall in form against the essential change required for it, and which is, in its essence, contrary to the foundations of vanity, and thus bearing the name of Jehovah, and even more so, the name of Jehovah God, in vain.
D.80.
In contrast to the suffering of man in the recent past, due to the activities of false prophets and thinkers, the modern combination of the approach of human thought to the unreal, subjective pole in its definition, and the distancing from the aspiration to the objective pole, together with the development of technology, constitute an existential danger to humanity that is contrary to its rational purpose. D.81. The suppression of the free, rational, and natural development of modern enlightened thought and of rational religious thought is part of the evolutionary investment of the thinking person, and therefore he poses a danger to the existence of which he is a part, and at the same time influences it through the power of his free will in sublime creation and free choice, exemplary and sublime among possibilities, to the extent that he is aware of them. D.82. Socrates showed humanity that man does not know the whole truth, and he did this by developing a constant and respectful discourse that did not involve silencing or denigrating or humiliating him, but rather a courageous, determined, and intelligently exemplarily dealing with the arguments that came up against him. D.83. The fate of Socrates is a parable and example of the constant struggle between those who seek the truth that will never be achieved, and those who seek the good of youth, that is, the good of their rule over the public in the past, present, and future. D.84. The fate of the prophet Moses is a parable and example of the constant struggle between interpretation in rational faith from the will to truth, and the danger of interpretation in rational faith from the will to power. D.85. The fate of Moses is clearly expressed in his marriage to Zipporah, daughter of Yitro, a priest of Midian, in the face of the destruction of the Midianites due to the affair between a Midianite woman and a son of Israel. In his practice with the calf worshippers after he descended from the mountain, in his practice with Korah's group, in his practice with the woodcutter on the Sabbath in the wilderness, in striking the rock instead of speaking to it, and more. D.86. The analogy with Moses' practice within the framework of the rational, godlike faith, without the and conjunction, to the Yahwistic powerful, stands in one subordination with the analogy with Abraham's practice within the framework of the godlike faith versus the Yahwistic natural faith in the case of the Akedah. The basis of the rational, faith-based analogy with the practice of the prophets and or rational, faith-based symbols is the consequences of the lack of a rational exemplary interpretation within the framework of the rational Israelite faith to raise the meaning and the essential interpretation together. These are consequences of a great disaster, both for faith and reason in themselves, and for man and his existence. In the latter, this disaster could have led to the end of life and development in rational faith, and from there to the end of humanity. And in the former, this disaster could have led to the end of the development of the state as a means to a rational society, free and equal. This rational disaster and rational faith leads at the beginning of the day to incomprehensible suffering of the leaders of reason and rational faith, and from there to the continuation of the path of error in their foundations against their enemies and the enemies of the exemplary and sublime human spirit. D.87. Therefore, the exemplary and sublime transition from the Jewish and subjective faith to the Israeli, God-objective faith of truth is characterized first and foremost by the transition from the will to power towards the will to truth, in an exemplary interpretation and in a sublime meaning in the rational, God-natural, and God-high faith. This transition is part of the path of truth and can be seen in relation to idolatry and the God-man in the Red Sea crossing, and in a modern way between the decadent and degenerate faith as a transition from, with a strong hand and an outstretched arm, to serving and preserving it together. This is the return to the foundations of rational faith of, "And you shall be my people, and I will be your God," in the later prophecy, after, "And I will walk among you, and I will be your God, and you shall be my people," in the foundational prophecy. This is the answer to the exemplary interpretation of the foundations. "And it shall come to pass in the last days, that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established in the top of the mountains, and shall be exalted above the hills, and all nations shall flow to it, and many peoples shall go and say, Come, and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, and let us learn his ways, and let us walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. This is the closing of the faith-rational circle, and the beginning of the return to the path of truth, which is expressed in an exemplary and sublime way in the vision of the new faith-rational covenant. Behold, the days come, saith the Lord, and I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day that I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, which they broke my covenant, although I myself was a master to them, saith the Lord. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, saith the Lord. I will put my law within them, and on their hearts will I write it, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. D88. The natural function of philosophers and men of rational faith, exemplary and sublime, is to distance rational and faith-rational thought and the possibilities of action derived from them from their imaginary subjective pole, and to bring them closer to their objective and unattainable pole in the way of truth. D89. The defining natural role of the philosophers and the exemplary and exalted rational believers is to open the door and gate for all of humanity to establish and develop the purpose of the sublime, meaningful thought towards the creation of a new old, exemplary and exalted being. The rational people of truth and the intelligent believers work by definition to combine the exemplary interpretative creation with the sublime, meaningful creation. D90. The defining natural role of the philosophers and the exemplary and exalted rational believers is to raise thought and the possibility of free and equal voluntary action for every woman and man on the lines of the aspiration for truth and transcendence. Their role operates within the framework of the purpose of man, that is, the aspiration for the exemplary interpretative identification of thought and voluntary action with being, and/or the boundary on its existential side, and the aspiration for the sublime, meaningful creation of a new old, sublime being. D91. The defining natural role of the exemplary and exalted philosophers and people of faith includes providing accessible tools for every woman and man to step forward in a voluntary manner, free and equal, towards the unity of being that creates consciousness in the most exemplary manner, and the will that creates being in the most exalted manner. The role of the exemplary and exalted philosophers and people of faith is to discover, interpret, teach, and uphold, and enable others to discover, interpret, teach, and uphold the position of rational man in relation to being, or the position of the faith-rational man in relation to God. D92. The work of the exemplary and exalted philosophers and people of faith, who know that the truth they strive for is never achieved, always proceeds through free, exemplary, substantial, and true discourse, and by providing a full, respectful, equal, and free opportunity for every woman and man to step forward in this discourse, both among themselves and between themselves and all human beings. D93. The essence of man on the way to the garden of the highest rational faith is thought that develops freely, equally, rationally, exemplary, and sublimely, and a free and equal choice in action in accordance with it. The essence of man on the way to the garden of the highest rational faith seeks truth, that is, harmony and identification both with things and what is between them, and with the boundary on its existential side between them and what is beyond them, and with God. D94. The exemplary and sublime essence of man is the exemplary interpretive thought and the choice in the action derived from it about the world and the boundary on its existential side, about what is present and appropriate in the three dimensions of thought open to each and every one. At the same time, the exemplary and sublime essence of man is the sublime and meaningful thought and action that creates a new old being in relation to everything and everything between things in the existence preceding it and opposite the fixed boundary on its existential side. D95. The rational and believing rational man is the free, equal, exemplary, and exalted man. The exemplary and exalted man returns to a free, essential, exemplary, and exalted discourse about understanding the world composed of all natural and abstract things alike, and what is in between, and on the boundary on its existential side between them and God, but not about God. The exemplary, exalted, free and equal man returns to his purpose as a thing with consciousness and free will that thinks, creates, and acts in the way of truth. The rational man returns to his purpose, the standing of man before being. The believing, rational, free and equal man returns to his noble and exemplary faith-rational purpose, the standing of man before God. See, say, speak and call, distinguish, do and give, bless, rest and sanctify, serve and keep. Be strong and courageous. Hallelujah. Amen.